The morning sun was just breaking over the Pacific horizon when the fifth wave of landing craft approached the dark volcanic sand of Iwo Jima's green beach. It was February 19th, 1945, and the clock read 9 in the morning. Among the vehicles emerging from those landing craft were 8 modified Sherman tanks that would forever change the way men fought underground battles in the Pacific theater. The Marines had given them a nickname that stuck, calling them Zippo tanks after the dependable cigarette lighters they carried in their pockets. The Japanese soldiers who would soon face these machines would come to know them by a different name entirely, one that spoke to the terror they inspired. They called them Haino Kuruma, which translates to chariots of fire. These 8 converted M4A3 Sherman tanks, split evenly between the 4th and 5th Tank Battalions, carried flame projectors capable of hurling streams of thickened gasoline mixed with napalm across distances that could reach 400 feet when conditions proved favorable. They were about to be used against fortified cave positions that Japanese commanders had considered absolutely impenetrable to conventional assault. What happened over the following weeks wasn't simply a shift in battlefield tactics. It represented something far more profound, a complete psychological breakdown of Japanese defensive strategy that commanders had spent months perfecting. These defenders had believed with absolute certainty that they had created the perfect defensive network, one that American forces could not possibly overcome without sustaining casualties so severe that the invasion might fail entirely. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. The Japanese transformation in defensive thinking had begun the previous summer, right after Saipan fell to American forces in July of 1944. The officer chosen to defend Iwo Jima was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a man who had carefully studied every single American amphibious assault since the bloody disaster at Tarawa. He had reached a conclusion that flew in the face of 3 solid years of established Japanese tactical doctrine, a conclusion that would have seemed like heresy to many of his peers. The Americans, he determined, simply could not be stopped at the waterline. Traditional beach defences were suicide. Deep beneath the island's surface, some 75 feet down in his underground command bunker, Kuribayashi had drafted what would become known as Defence Order No. 1. The date was December 1st, 1944. The order was revolutionary in its departure from standard practice. "We shall not engage the enemy on the beaches," it read. "We shall allow him to land unopposed. We shall let him penetrate inland, and then we shall kill him from positions he cannot possibly reach with conventional weapons." The mathematics of defensive warfare had undergone a fundamental shift in Kuribayashi's thinking. At Tarawa, 4,500 Japanese defenders had been killed in just 76 hours of brutal frontal combat. At Saipan, 30,000 defenders had been wiped out in less than a month of mobile defensive operations. But here on this 8-square-mile chunk of volcanic rock called Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi commanded 21,000 men who had essentially vanished into the earth itself. They occupied 11 miles of interconnected tunnels linking roughly 1,500 man-made caves and reinforced pillboxes. The construction effort had been nothing short of extraordinary. Approximately a quarter of the entire garrison, something like 5,250 men, had been assigned to construction duties, working under conditions that can only be described as hellish. Temperatures inside those volcanic tunnels regularly climbed to between 30 and 50 degrees Celsius, which translates to somewhere between 86 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The sulfur fumes were so toxic that workers could only dig for 5-minute intervals before they had to retreat to breathe cleaner air. The caves themselves varied enormously in size and capacity. Some were tiny positions designed to hold just 3 or 4 men with a machine gun or mortar. Others were massive chambers capable of housing 300 to 400 soldiers. Kuribayashi's personal command post featured 150 meters of connecting tunnels on its own, while Mount Suribachi, the iconic volcano at the island's southern tip, contained 7 distinct levels of underground fortifications. The Japanese engineers had poured concrete for 800 separate pillboxes, some with walls 4 feet thick. They had learned from 3 years of watching American assault tactics evolve. They knew all about flamethrowers, the M1 and M2 portable units that infantry carried into battle. They knew those weapons could project flames anywhere from 40 to 60 feet under normal combat conditions. With this knowledge in mind, they had designed their caves accordingly, creating entrance tunnels that extended 100 feet or more before reaching the actual living chambers where men would shelter and fight. They knew about satchel charges too, those canvas bags packed with explosives that demolition teams would try to throw into cave mouths. They had calculated correctly that the volcanic rock of Jima could withstand anything that was light enough for an infantryman to carry and throw. What the Japanese had created was what military engineers would later describe as the most sophisticated defensive network constructed anywhere during the entire Second World War. 21,000 men had disappeared into an island measuring just 8 square miles. They had calculated for every American weapons system they knew existed, every tactic they had observed in previous battles. What they had not calculated for, what they could not possibly have anticipated, was a main battle tank that could project liquid fire at distances they had considered physically impossible. The weapon that would ultimately break Iwo Jima's cave defences had not been developed at some research facility back in the States. It had been born from desperate necessity 13 months earlier in the Marshall Islands. On February 1, 1944, Marine tank crews assaulting the islands of Roy Namur had run into Japanese bunkers that seemed utterly immune to direct hits from 75mm tank guns. The shells would slam into these reinforced positions and accomplish essentially nothing. The solution emerged through an unlikely collaboration between the Seabees, those naval construction battalions that built everything the Pacific War needed, and the Chemical Warfare Service, which specialized in exactly the kind of unconventional weapons this situation demanded. According to records maintained by the Navy, teams of engineers and technicians at Pearl Harbor's massive Navy yard began the process of converting battle-damaged Sherman tanks into something entirely new. The technical designation they gave these converted vehicles was POA-CWSH-1, developed specifically for Pacific theater operations. The technical specifications documented in Navy Department archives reveal just how revolutionary these weapons really were. The main 75mm gun was completely removed and replaced with a Mark I Navy flame projector. The system operated under compressed gas pressure of 300 pounds per square inch, and it could maintain continuous fire for somewhere between 55 and 80 seconds before exhausting its fuel supply. The fuel itself was a carefully engineered mixture of ordinary gasoline that had been thickened with napalm, those aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids that Louis Fieser's team at Harvard University had developed back in 1942. Initial testing at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii during March of '44 demonstrated something remarkable. Under optimal conditions, with everything working perfectly and the wind cooperating, flame streams could reach distances up to 400 feet. In actual combat conditions, the effective range typically fell somewhere between 150 and 200 yards, which was still absolutely extraordinary for a flame weapon. The flame projector could deliver what observers described as a solid rod of fire, a coherent stream that could be directed across targets with devastating precision. During those early tests, observers made a discovery that would prove crucial to future operations. When thickened gasoline entered cave systems, it didn't just burn at the entrance. It behaved like a liquid, because that's what it was. It would flow through tunnel systems, following gravity down passages, running around corners, continuing to burn at temperatures that reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit while simultaneously consuming every molecule of available oxygen. The first combat deployment of these flame tanks on Iwo Jima occurred on February 21, '45. That was D-Day +2, and the time was 2:30 in the afternoon. The location was the eastern slope of Mount Suribachi. Marine casualties had been steadily mounting as concealed Japanese positions continued to pour devastating fire onto advancing infantry units. Traditional assault tactics, the kind that had worked elsewhere, were proving incredibly costly in both time and blood. According to records maintained by the 5th Tank Battalion, the flame tank designated Satan, yes, that was actually its name, advanced to approximately 150 yards from suspected cave positions. At 14:37 hours, 2:37 in the afternoon, the flame gunner triggered the Mark I projector for the first time in combat on Iwo Jima. The official after-action reports describe what happened next in language that somehow manages to be both clinical and horrifying. Streams of liquid fire maintained perfect cohesion across hundreds of feet of empty air before splashing against the mountainside and flowing directly into cave entrances. The thickened gasoline, sticky and persistent, flowed down entrance tunnels exactly as water would, running around defensive angles that had been specifically designed to stop conventional weapons, pooling in low spots and continuing to burn. The Japanese defensive manual that was captured after the battle had dedicated exactly one paragraph to flame weapons. The authors had assumed they were dealing with portable flamethrowers with maximum ranges of 20 meters and fuel supplies that limited attacks to 8 or 10 seconds at most. The flame tanks carried vastly more fuel and could deliver sustained streams for over a full minute of continuous fire. The physics of what happened when flame entered confined spaces had been carefully documented by Chemical Warfare Service technical teams. The Mark I flame projector delivered multiple gallons of thickened fuel per second at 300 pounds per square inch of pressure. When this entered a cave system, the effects were immediate and catastrophic through multiple mechanisms. Direct immolation from fuel contact at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit created instant casualties among anyone the burning liquid actually touched. Radiant heat caused third-degree burns at considerable distances from the flame itself, meaning you didn't even have to be directly in contact with fire to suffer terrible injuries. Complete oxygen depletion occurred within seconds in confined underground spaces, suffocating anyone who survived the initial heat. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide concentrations reached lethal levels almost immediately. The thermal expansion of the volcanic rock itself could actually cause structural collapse of the tunnels. A single sustained burst could create conditions that were absolutely unsurvivable throughout interconnected cave systems. The 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company, which perfected the stabilized flamethrower fuel mixture in June of '45, documented another critical factor. The thickened fuel would adhere to surfaces and continue burning for extended periods, making it impossible for defenders to reoccupy positions even after the initial attack ended. February 23, 1945, D-Day +4. Mount Suribachi's final assault was beginning. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson's 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, received direct support from flame tanks for the final reduction of defensive positions on the volcano's summit. Marine Corps records indicate that 165 separate caves had been identified on the volcano's slopes. Using traditional tactics, clearing each of those positions would have required extensive casualties, probably hundreds of Marines killed or wounded. The flame tank crews had been rapidly developing new tactics, and these were carefully documented in tank battalion reports filed during and after the battle. The standard operating procedure that emerged was based on tanks operating in pairs. One flame tank would be partnered with one standard Sherman, providing covering fire with its main gun. The approach followed a systematic pattern that proved highly effective. First, advance to effective range, typically somewhere between 150 and 200 yards from the target. Second, suppress any visible enemy positions with conventional fire from the accompanying Sherman. Third, engage the caves with sustained flame for 30 to 40 seconds. Fourth, displace to a new position and wait for results. The 28th Marines After-Action Report for February 23rd documents the outcome in stark numerical terms. 47 cave positions were neutralized that day. Friendly casualties amounted to 3 wounded. Enemy killed was estimated at 800. This represented a complete reversal of the expected casualty ratios for cave warfare, where attackers typically suffered far heavier losses than defenders. Radio intercepts that were decoded by Fleet Radio Unit Pacific documented Japanese command communications that paint a picture of complete desperation. Messages from the Suribachi garrison requested permission for a final banzai charge, explaining that they could not maintain their positions against the flame weapons. This was extraordinary, because Japanese doctrine emphasized holding defensive positions to the death, not abandoning them for suicidal charges. Combat operations drove immediate battlefield modifications that were carefully documented by construction battalion maintenance units. Initial problems included fuel mixture adjustments that were necessary for cold morning temperatures when the thickened gasoline wouldn't flow properly. Ignition system failures from volcanic dust getting into the mechanisms were another persistent problem. The solutions that crews and maintenance personnel developed on the spot included installing secondary electric igniters as backups and welding additional armor plates onto critical areas to protect against damage from volcanic rock fragments. Within just a few days, crews discovered through experimentation that mixing diesel fuel with the napalm gasoline mixture created denser, thicker smoke that penetrated better into ventilation systems. They developed what they called the splash technique, which involved deliberately overshooting cave mouths so that burning fuel would run down cliff faces into hidden entrances that weren't visible from the tank's positions. Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi, who commanded the 26th Tank Regiment, attempted to counter the American flame tanks with his remaining Type 97 medium tanks. The engagement occurred on February 24th and lasted just a few minutes. 3 Type 97 tanks were destroyed without managing to damage any American tanks. Nishi himself died later in a cave in the northern sector of the island, according to Japanese records that were recovered after the war ended. February 26, 1945. The assault on Hills 382 and 362A demonstrated what flame tanks could accomplish against interconnected bunker systems. The defensive complex beneath Hill 382, according to captured Japanese engineering documents, featured multiple tunnel levels connecting dozens of separate fighting positions. Marine Corps records described the assault beginning at 6:30 in the morning. Flame tanks deliberately targeted ventilation shafts rather than cave mouths themselves, allowing gravity to distribute fire throughout the entire complex from above. Official reports noted smoke emerging from dozens of previously unidentified exits, effectively creating a complete map of the tunnel system just by watching where the smoke came out. The 3rd Marine Division's intelligence section reported something unprecedented. Defenders were abandoning positions before flame tanks even arrived. Several bunkers were found completely abandoned with supplies and equipment still intact. This was absolutely unprecedented in Japanese defensive doctrine, which emphasized fighting to the death from prepared positions. By late February, Marine intelligence officers documented what they termed cascade collapse in Japanese morale across the entire island. The psychological impact of these weapons exceeded their physical destruction. For the first time in the entire Pacific War, significant numbers of Japanese soldiers were surrendering rather than fighting to the death. Marine intelligence reports noted that Japanese prisoners consistently used terms like demon weapon and dragon's breath when describing their experiences with flame tanks. The 216 prisoners taken during the entire battle represented the first significant Japanese surrenders of the Pacific War. Post-war interrogations revealed that many of these men surrendered specifically to avoid death by burning, rather than because they had been wounded or cut off from their units. Captured Japanese documents included in the Pacific War records indicated that entire units were abandoning carefully prepared positions simply upon reports that flame tanks were approaching their sector. This represented a complete breakdown of the Bushido warrior code that had sustained Japanese resistance through every previous battle in the war. March 2nd, 1945. The battle for Motoyama Airfield No. 2 saw the systematic employment of flame tanks according to a carefully planned assault schedule. Japanese forces had constructed 280 interconnected strongpoints around this critical airfield according to captured defensive plans. Tank battalion records document flame tank operations that methodically reduced these positions one after another. The psychological effect became increasingly apparent as the battle continued. More bunkers were found abandoned, complete with ammunition and personal effects left behind by defenders who had fled. This demonstrated that Japanese forces were choosing preservation over honorable death for the first time on this scale in any Pacific War battle. March 10, 1945. Operations introduced experimental seismic detection equipment that was operated by naval technical specialists. Using modified equipment originally designed for oil exploration, these teams could detect underground tunnel systems and provide flame tank commanders with precise targeting data about where caves existed even when no entrance was visible from the surface. Major General Graves Erskine, who commanded the 3rd Marine Division, described this development in his after-action report as three-dimensional warfare. The Marines were fighting simultaneously above ground, on the surface, and underground, all at the same time. The combination of seismic detection technology and flame weapons proved devastatingly effective against deep tunnel complexes that would have been almost impossible to locate and reduce using conventional methods. By March 16th, flame tank operations had evolved significantly from those first experimental uses back on the 19th of February. While the standard effective range remained somewhere between 150 and 200 yards, crews had experimented extensively with pressure adjustments and fuel modifications to extend range when tactical situations required it. Marine Tank Battalion records document various technical innovations that were developed right there during actual combat operations, not in some research facility back home. The psychological impact of these weapons extended far beyond their actual technical capabilities. Japanese communications that were intercepted by radio intelligence units indicated a widespread belief among defenders that American flame weapons had essentially unlimited range. This belief contributed to what military analysts termed defensive collapse. Official Marine Corps records document the flame tank operations on Jima across the entire operational period. The battle lasted from February 19th through March 26, 1945, a total of 36 days of continuous combat. 8 flame tanks were deployed in total, 4 assigned to the 4th Tank Battalion and 4 to the 5th Tank Battalion. Daily fuel consumption reached between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons during peak operations. Cave positions neutralized numbered in the hundreds according to unit records, though exact counts were impossible to maintain during fluid combat operations. Japanese casualties specifically from flame weapons ran into the thousands, though the exact number could never be determined with precision. Marine casualties prevented by using flame tanks instead of conventional assault tactics were estimated in the thousands based on calculations of what traditional assault methods would have cost. Comparative analysis demonstrated the dramatic difference in effectiveness. Traditional cave assault tactics required multiple infantry squads per position, with 20 to 30% casualties expected for each cave that needed to be cleared. Flame tank operations could neutralize multiple positions per hour with minimal friendly casualties, often none at all. The success achieved at Iwo Jima had immediate and profound influence on planning for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands. Joint Chiefs of Staff documents indicate that military planners requested massive increases in flame tank production based directly on results from Iwo Jima. The demonstration that cave defences could be systematically neutralised altered fundamental invasion calculations and casualty estimates. Japanese military intelligence, of course, understood what had happened. Post-war interrogations of senior Japanese officers revealed that they knew American flame tank capabilities would make cave defences on the home islands far less effective than they had hoped. Corporal Herschel Williams of the 21st Marines earned the Medal of Honor for actions on February 23rd using a portable flamethrower rather than one of the tank-mounted weapons. Operating for 4 hours under intense enemy fire, Williams systematically eliminated multiple Japanese positions while covered by riflemen who protected him from enemy soldiers trying to kill him before he could bring his weapon to bear. His citation notes that he neutralized one fortified position after another, enabling marine advances that would have been impossible otherwise. Williams later provided testimony about the tactical importance of flame weapons that military historians have preserved. The Japanese had built these positions to withstand everything we had, he explained. But fire goes where bullets cannot reach. It finds every space, every corner, every pocket of air. One flame tank could accomplish what would cost us dozens of men to achieve using conventional assault methods. Marine tank crews documented the psychological burden that came with operating flame weapons, and this documentation proved important for post-war analysis. Veterans Administration studies conducted in the years after the war found that flame tank crewmen experienced combat stress disorders at significantly higher rates than other armoured unit personnel. The intimate nature of flame warfare, the visual and auditory awareness of enemy casualties, created unique psychological challenges that other tankers did not face to the same degree. Captured Japanese documents and extensive post-war interrogations revealed the complete inadequacy of Japanese preparations for flame tank warfare. They had extensive practical experience with portable flamethrowers, the kind that infantrymen carried, but they had not anticipated vehicle-mounted weapons with extended range and massive fuel capacity that dwarfed anything they had encountered before. General Kuribayashi's final message, transmitted shortly before his death in late March, acknowledged the situation with remarkable clarity. "Enemy flame tanks have neutralized our cave defenses," he reported. "Positions that required months of brutal labor to construct are being destroyed in minutes. American industrial technology has overcome Japanese fighting spirit." This message, intercepted by American radio intelligence personnel, confirmed the decisive impact these weapons had achieved. Post-war testimony from the handful of Japanese survivors confirmed the absolute terror these weapons inspired among defenders. One survivor, providing testimony to war crimes investigators who were examining various aspects of the Pacific War, stated that soldiers who had faced death courageously in previous battles would flee in panic from flame tanks. The weapons created a form of death that contradicted fundamental concepts of honorable military service that these men had been raised to believe in. The lessons learned from Iwo Jima were immediately applied to Okinawa operations that began on April 1, 1945. Marine Corps records show dramatically expanded flame tank deployment with improved tactics based directly on Iwo Jima experience. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who served as operations officer for the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, had carefully studied Iwo Jima reports according to documents that were captured later. His defensive preparations included water reservoirs intended to flood tunnels if flame attacks occurred, extended tunnel systems designed to dissipate heat, and specially constructed flame barriers. All of these measures proved essentially ineffective against improved American flame tank tactics. Marine units landing on Okinawa received enhanced flame tank support with specialized fuel supply infrastructure that had been planned in advance. The 713th Flamethrower Tank Battalion, specially created for Okinawa operations, documented even more effective employment than what had been achieved at Iwo Jima. The flame tank operations represented far more than just the weapons themselves. They required massive industrial support infrastructure. Navy construction battalions built fuel storage and mixing facilities even while combat operations were still ongoing. By the time the battle ended, the infrastructure that had been constructed included underground fuel storage facilities protected from Japanese artillery, mixing stations where napalm compounds were combined with gasoline, miles of fuel distribution pipeline running across the island, and forward resupply points positioned close to the front lines. The Chemical Warfare Service documented that operations required daily delivery of thousands of gallons of fuel components. The entire supply chain, stretching from chemical plants back in the continental United States producing napalm compounds all the way to frontline fuel mixing stations, demonstrated American industrial capacity that Japanese forces simply could not match under any circumstances. Medical records from Navy hospital ships documented the unique casualties created by flame weapons, and these records proved important for developing treatment protocols. Burns, smoke inhalation injuries, and carbon monoxide poisoning required specialized treatment approaches. The hospital ship USS Samaritan reported treating both American and Japanese burn casualties, though Japanese soldiers initially resisted medical treatment, believing they had dishonored themselves by surviving when they should have died. International Red Cross representatives, who were permitted to inspect prisoner-of-war facilities, documented that captured Japanese soldiers expressed particular fear of flame weapons compared to other weapons systems. This factor contributed significantly to the unprecedented number of surrenders compared to previous Pacific battles, where Japanese forces had fought virtually to the last man. The flame tank innovations achieved at Iwo Jima influenced military development for many decades afterward. Official military histories trace direct lineage from these weapons to flame tanks used in the Korean War, flame tanks employed in Vietnam, and modern thermobaric weapons that operate on fundamentally similar principles of using heat and pressure in confined spaces. The fundamental principle of using flowing burning liquid to clear enclosed spaces remains relevant to modern military operations. Contemporary military doctrine for tunnel and cave warfare still references lessons that were learned from Iwo Jima flame tank operations more than 80 years ago. The United States Marine Corps official history includes a direct statement about the significance of these weapons. The development of the flame-throwing tank was one of the most significant American technical innovations in the entire Pacific War. At Iwo Jima, these weapons proved absolutely decisive in reducing Japanese cave positions that would have cost thousands of Marine casualties if conventional assault tactics had been required. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet, noted in his official report that the flame-throwing tanks proved to be the single most effective weapon for reduction of Japanese cave defences. Without these weapons, he stated, American casualties would have been infinitely greater than what was actually suffered. General Holland Smith, commanding 5th Amphibious Corps, wrote in his assessment that the 8 flame tanks deployed on Iwo Jima were worth an entire battalion of infantry in terms of their capability to neutralize Japanese fortifications. They saved countless Marine lives, he concluded. While flame tanks dramatically reduced American casualties, they created unique moral challenges that were documented in military chaplain reports filed during and after the battle. Marines struggled psychologically with the nature of the weapon, even while they recognized its absolute necessity for accomplishing their mission. Military chaplains reported significantly increased requests for counseling from flame tank crews compared to personnel in other types of units. The Japanese perspective, documented through extensive post-war testimony and analysis of captured documents, reveals the complete collapse of their defensive strategy at a fundamental level. Forces that had been psychologically prepared to die in conventional combat found themselves fleeing from a form of death they had never anticipated and could not reconcile with their training. This psychological defeat preceded and enabled the physical defeat that followed. Military legal reviews conducted both during and after the war confirmed that flame weapons were perfectly legal under international law as it existed in 1945. The weapons were not specifically prohibited by either the Geneva Conventions or the Hague Conventions. Their use against military fortifications was considered entirely legitimate under the laws of war as they were understood at that time. Post-war war crimes trials did not prosecute flame weapon use by either side in the conflict. The weapons were considered a legitimate and proportionate response to Japanese cave fortifications that could not be effectively reduced by other available means without causing excessive casualties among attacking forces. The annual reunion of honor ceremonies held on Iwo Jima, which began in 1970, have brought together American and Japanese veterans in a spirit of reconciliation. These gatherings, documented by both governments, demonstrate how former enemies found common ground decades after the battle. At the 40th anniversary reunion held in 1985, Japanese and American veterans met together at specific sites where flame tanks had been employed during the battle. Japanese survivors acknowledged the weapon's devastating effectiveness, while American veterans expressed genuine respect for Japanese courage in the face of such terrible weapons. These meetings, carefully documented by military historians from both nations, show how former enemies found mutual understanding through shared experience of combat. The 75th anniversary reunion held in March of 2020 included only a handful of American veterans still physically able to make the journey, highlighting the inevitable passing of this generation. Their final testimonies, recorded for historical preservation, emphasize both the absolute necessity of flame warfare given the tactical situation and the horror of what these weapons actually did to human beings. The National Archives contains extensive documentation of flame tank operations at Iwo Jima that researchers can access. Tank Battalion war diaries, detailed after-action reports, and technical assessments provide comprehensive operational records. Japanese documents captured immediately after the battle and testimony gathered from post-war interrogations confirm the weapon's devastating impact from the defender's perspective. The Marine Corps History Division maintains official records that document how flame tanks fundamentally changed cave warfare tactics for all future operations. These weapons demonstrated conclusively that technological innovation could overcome defensive advantages that had cost thousands of casualties in previous operations where such weapons were not available. Photographic evidence taken by combat photographers shows flame tanks in action during the battle, their streams of fire reaching toward Japanese positions. Film footage, now carefully preserved in military archives, captures the weapon's devastating effectiveness against cave fortifications in ways that written reports alone cannot convey. The deployment of just 8 flame tanks to Iwo Jima represented something far more significant than simple tactical innovation on a local battlefield. It demonstrated with absolute clarity how industrial capacity combined with technological development could fundamentally alter combat dynamics in ways that human courage and determination could not overcome. These weapons negated defensive advantages that Japanese forces had spent months of backbreaking labor creating under terrible conditions. The streams of liquid fire that could reach up to 400 feet under optimal conditions didn't merely clear caves of their defenders. They cleared away all illusions about the nature of modern industrial warfare and what it meant for traditional concepts of martial valor. Japanese forces that had prepared meticulously for conventional assault tactics found themselves facing a weapon that flowed through their carefully constructed defenses as inevitably as American victory ultimately flowed from overwhelming industrial superiority. The Japanese troops who abandoned their caves when confronted by flame tanks were making entirely rational decisions when facing a technology that had rendered their fortifications into death traps rather than defensive strongpoints. Their careful preparations, based on reasonable expectations drawn from previous combat experience, proved worthless against liquid fire that followed simple gravity through every tunnel passage and consumed oxygen from every underground chamber. The flame tanks saved thousands of American lives by avoiding the horrific casualties that methodical cave-by-cave fighting would have inevitably required using conventional infantry assault methods. They also inflicted a particular form of death that haunted the men who employed these weapons and absolutely terrified those who faced them. This duality, representing salvation for one side and horror for the other, defines their complex legacy in military history. Military historians universally recognize the flame tanks deployed at Iwo Jima as a decisive innovation that significantly shortened the battle's duration and dramatically reduced American casualties below what they would otherwise have been. The weapons demonstrated with perfect clarity that in modern industrial warfare, technological superiority could completely overcome human courage and determination when the disparity between opposing forces became overwhelming enough. The 8 flame tanks deployed to Iwo Jima proved a fundamental truth about industrial age warfare that remains valid today. Victory belongs not necessarily to the brave or the determined, but rather to those forces possessing superior tools and the industrial capacity to employ them with devastating effectiveness across an entire theatre of operations. The Japanese defenders discovered through bitter experience that warrior spirit, no matter how deeply ingrained through training and culture, could not stop liquid fire from flowing into tunnels. They learned that personal courage, even of the highest order, could not overcome the basic chemistry of napalm burning at 2,000 degrees. They found that determination and willingness to die meant absolutely nothing when flames flowed through underground passages like water inevitably seeking its lowest level. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of absolutely brutal warfare. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders who had garrisoned the island, roughly 20,000 died in the fighting. Only 216 surrendered during the actual battle, which represented an unprecedented number for Pacific War operations, where Japanese forces typically fought literally to the last man. American forces suffered casualties totaling 6,140 killed and 17,913 wounded, according to official casualty figures compiled after the battle. Without flame tanks, military analysts universally agree these already terrible casualties would have been significantly higher, possibly catastrophically so. The transformation was absolutely complete, from faith in the power of defensive fortifications to recognition that technology could negate any positional advantage no matter how carefully prepared. The flame tanks had demonstrated beyond any possible doubt that in the cold arithmetic of modern warfare, industrial capacity multiplied by technological innovation equals victory, completely regardless of human courage displayed by forces on the other side of that equation. Today, Iwo Jima, which has been returned to its original Japanese name of Iwo-to, stands as a permanent monument to the terrible price of victory in modern industrial warfare. The caves that once provided shelter to Japanese defenders remain in place, some still showing visible scorch marks from flame tank operations conducted 8 decades ago. They serve as permanent physical testimony to the precise moment when liquid fire fundamentally transformed the nature of cave warfare and demonstrated with absolute finality the decisive power of industrial might in modern combat operations.